Today we're using Caran D'Ache's Neocolour 2 Aquarelle. These are water-soluble wax pastels. They come in, I think, over 100 colours. And I have 24 colours here to play with today. You might have seen me using these already on the channel. I used them on one of my recent sketching videos out and about, which is why there's some grass in here. And I also took them on a camping holiday and did a few fun landscapes with them. What I want to show you today is the kind of marks these can make, how we can use them with water to really bring them to life, and how they do really shine when we make simple, beautiful little landscapes with them. So with all that said and done, I'll get these out and about and we're ready to explore. So you can see I've got all my colours, and I'm afraid I have mixed them up somewhat because I've been using them out on the road, and that's what I found them amazing for, is getting out and having these super vibrant colours. If we just pick up a couple, just look how beautifully vibrant and bold they are. And the amazing thing is they do act just like wax crayons, like simple Crayola crayons you might have played with as a child. They make easy marks, they make big bold textures, they build up so we can layer and get different levels of value from really light to really dark and intense. And even these bright colours, the greens, have a huge value range. Obviously it's difficult to draw really detailed things with them, so if I try and draw a little self-portrait, it will look hopefully reminiscent. But we are drawing with a fairly blunt instrument. You can of course sharpen these using a little bit of a knife to sharpen the edge. I mean, you can just immediately tell these are such vibrant, lovely things to use. They're so easy to get pigment on the page. Actually, the biggest risk, the biggest challenge, is learning when enough is enough. Not learning how to use them, it's how to stop using them. But there you go, lots of dry and simple marks. And we'll explore more of these as we paint our artwork later. But just to show you, the next most important thing is these are black magic, I think. Not sure how it works, but these are wax crayons, but they are water soluble. So as I pop some water onto the page, you'll see they start to lift and move. I can paint with this lovely deep green, I can move it into this bright green, and they will act to activate just like watercolour pencils in many ways. You'll have this underlying texture. You can see where I've pressed really hard, that texture will rarely go, but they will also become bright and bold and vivid. And you can even go to the other side and paint. So I could take pigment from here and do a quick little bit of mark making over on the other side. Now there are things which make these significantly more, significantly different to watercolour pencils and to watercolour paints as well. Not just the fact they're in crayons, but also the fact that they are opaque. So if I let this dry, and as if by magic, we can then come back. And if I start layering on top, unlike watercolour paints, where you would see the underlying colour, here you can see actually the pastel, or the oil pastel, whatever we're going to call these, the crayon, sits firmly on top of that colour. Now this isn't a one-way street, because we can of course come back in with water, and then that water will make some of that colour shift and become, like watercolour, transparent. So it is a learning curve in many ways. These do act similarly to watercolours in some ways, but in many other ways they are different. The last thing I'd love to show you before we just dive straight into painting is what happens if we paint wet on wet, or draw wet on wet. So if we take some vibrant colours, they're all vibrant of course, and we come into this box, you can see they activate quickly already. So here we have this dry, hard texture. Here we have a slightly lighter tone of green, and it's softer. Using a red, that might be even more obvious. So we have this soft line work, versus here on the dry, Do you see how the tone, the colour, the hue is a bit different? And also the textures are very different. So they really do get influenced hugely by water. They dry like watercolours. You can see them drying over here paler and with interesting textures. But they layer differently. They layer opaquely, like gouache or like acrylic, or like traditional wax pastels. Before we jump into a studio sketch together, where I'll be showing you sort of step by step how I use them, I thought I'd show you my first experiment with these, which was outside camping. You can see here I'm dressed in a silly coat, and we are joined by Betty, of course, in the background. And all I'm doing, sat with both a sketchbook on my lap and all of these crayons on my lap, and I'm picking out from the view I have from the campsite big blocks of colour. And I'm trying not to overdo things, trying not to finish the sketch before I started. With these initial marks, you can see all those textures that we were talking about, that we were practicing. This is all dry on dry. The crayons are dry, the page is dry. So we're getting very dry textures. The thing to do here is not to try and finish off your painting with this first sketch when we add water. And we can do that using a very cheap water brush. When we add that water, look at how the page comes to life and really fills with colour. Look at how the paints move as well. Look at how we can pick up pigment from one place and use it elsewhere. So we don't need the pigment we're going to be using to be in the right place when we put it down. We just need it somewhere on the page, and we can kind of work it out from there. As this sketch progressed, I was starting to understand a little bit more about how malleable these pigments are, and I must say I'm super impressed. Using them like this, it feels a lot like drawing with oil pastels, for example, but with a lot more freedom to make different looser marks and then correct things later with the water, or make things looser later with the water. Also, the punchy colours are very punchy. That tiny touch of red in the background, I think more than enough to bring this sketch to life. And actually, if I added water to that, it would probably go everywhere and I'd end up with a very vibrant sketch. Perhaps not quite how I wanted. You'll also notice with this, I'm really layering and layering, and I end up with quite a waxy feel to my sketch. Now, if we're using these with ink and wash, we need to be careful we don't overdo it. So, for example, here, doing a quick still life of some things I'd picked up, you can see I'm being much more delicate with the colours, using them more abstract and for colour, and that enables me to get a very different feel to those colours as well. And with that, let's move back into the studio. Rather than reinventing the wheel, what I am going to do is use these like I would watercolours, in the sense of doing a bit of line and wash. So I've got my landscape here, and I'm going to do a very simple drawing. Now, because these are opaque when you layer them and they become sort of waxy on the page, even though they interact with water, what it can mean is your lines can get lost behind them. So there's no point in doing a really detailed line drawing, and this is where they really shine for me, in these simple landscapes. So if I just draw the little segments of my landscape, get those big shapes in, the idea of some of these trees going backwards, but leave lots to the imagination, and lots where we can actually build up like we would with painting, rather than with line and wash, where often we're just doing a quick wash on top. And one more little segment across here. We've got an idea already, just with some simple lines of our landscape. Just to make things more structured, I'm going to add a couple of bold lines where these deepest, darkest shadows are, and start just suggesting a few textures. And it's going to be interesting as we add our wax, our crayons or colour. It's going to be interesting seeing how these lines develop, whether they actually show up at all, whether this needs to be something to change in future. Same over here, some of these boldest trees, I know they're very abstract, but we can still just produce a little bit more certainty to them by giving them slightly bolder marks. And let's do a couple of textures in the foreground as well, why not? We've already seen, however, that these pastels create amazing textures. So I'm going to leave it there and jump in. Now, with these pastels, we can mix them on the page, but we can't mix them before that. So we have to choose our colours wisely to some extent. I would like to get these bright kind of green hues, and we've got yellow greens, haven't we? But let's get something earthy as well. So I've got here lemon yellow, I've got yellow, simply named, I've got olive, which is light olive actually, and I've got dark olive. So earthy greens and lemony, yellowy hues as well. And I'm going to start identifying areas to add these colours to. So I've got this yellow field off to one side. I've got a yellow feeling stripe running through here. Not getting too specific whatsoever. Here I'll just move straight on and get some of these little lines of slightly greener colour running through these kind of field lines. We've got some of those lines here as well. And I'll just give an edge to this bit of yellow. And I'm only wanting to pop down a little bit of pigment at a time. So I'll use my light olive to find some of these lighter greens in the background as well. And then move straight on to the deep olive, where we'll get some of these other colours. Remember, these are super bold, so when we add water, things are going to move a lot. We're going to fill a lot of this page with pigment. You do not need to fill the whole page now. We just want a little bit, little by little. I'm going to put those to one side, so I know I've used them already. And then let's explore the sky as another interesting area. Again, this is a light blue sky, isn't it? So let's pick a bit of turquoise. I've got this nice looking blue hue here, which is light blue. And we'll pick up a grey as well. Grey, not something we often use in watercolour, so it's interesting having it as an option when we're using a different medium. And I'm just going to start with finding those areas of colour again. We've got some sort of turquoises in the lower region. Got these lines of perspective running through. You can feel the clouds sort of climbing as they get away, and the sky getting deeper blue as it reaches up. And then I'm going to use these greys just to delineate the bottom of some of these areas of perspective and add a little bit of sort of tonal variation into the sky. And there you go. My first layer of pigment already done. And now we just activate it. So a nice big brush, and we start seeing what we've done. This is where we really find out if we're on the right path or not. It's important to keep wetting your brush, and if you're moving from colour to colour, to also clean your brush off in between, because otherwise you'll start murkying and muddying things up. And just remember how much you can move the pigment, how much. This is on good quality paper now, this is cotton paper, so I can actually lift a lot of the pigment and let it sort of float around, really create something a lot different to what those initial marks might suggest. Just like painting with soft pastels, don't feel with these that you need to be tied down to your initial placement of the colour. It can move an awfully long way. Some of these edges would probably be a little nicer if they were softer, or even just a bit more painterly, so we can add in these essence of brush strokes coming out. And there we go, a nice soft sky. Whilst that's still wet, with these we have the fortune of being able to build into it if we want some brightness. Just like I would touch in watercolours, we can touch in little elements more of these pastels and see how they activate in such a different way now that the water is there. Again, being careful not to overdo it. We don't want to end up with too much busyness, too much pigment, or that overly waxy feel. Like that, I will move on. I'll take my own advice. So I'm going to come into these yellows next, and then go straight from the yellows into the greens, into these olives. Just letting them push, move around, and not trying to say or do too much with these initial marks. I think these work best when we use them lightly and gently. Don't try too hard. So all I'm doing is trying to activate things little by little. And I also want to leave some space. So we'll leave little areas of white. let's link things up as well. I love linking the sky into a landscape, and that I hope will make these all feel a lot more fluid. And we can also start to observe just how much they do move, actually even more than I expected to. See how this yellow is climbing up through the page? That is, I was expecting some movement, but that's an awful lot of movement for a sort of dry media which we've just wetted. I'm rather impressed, actually. Maybe impressed and concerned, because I was anticipating a small amount of movement. You can see it's going and going and going. But there you go, that's what you get for playing with water-soluble media. You get a lot of unpredictability. Now I'm going to just start, again, layering in, getting a bit more of that dark feel. Keeping an eye on this patch. We'll see as it dries what happens, whether we want to come back and protect it or correct anything in there. Little scratchy marks, and then I didn't add any initial marks into the tree, but it might be nice to just do some little suggestions here and there, little bits only, and that might move us on to sort of think about the deeper colours as well. So let's get, I've got here a brown, simply named, and we'll get the idea of the tree trunk in, and then we can work this brown into a few more textures, into a few of these trees in the background. Just little dibs and dabs, all I'm looking for. Now I've decided it is moving an awful long way, so let's just see what happens if we try and lift some of that pigment. And it lifts very nicely, doesn't it? It's probably sat there in a pool of water just waiting to be whisked away. And I think that does feel a little more believable, doesn't it? It feels a little, it's nice that it's seeping up, but it's also nice that we controlled what was happening a little bit. And just a few more touches. You can see here, these areas are nice and soft from that wet on wet approach. And I'm actually rather liking this. It's a simple landscape. It's just coming together very quickly. I'm not overcomplicating things, and I'm exploring a new media. One thing which is missing are the shadows. So let's get brave and bold with the shadows. Now in the previous sketches I've done, I used a bit of black. I'll do a tiny bit here to show you just how black this black is. So you can hopefully see, even here, super intense. If I do little lines, super intense. Now this sort of scared me before. So I'm going to avoid the black, because when I then tried to move it around, it wasn't so much a shadow, it was an overwhelming mass. Instead, we can play with slightly more abstract shadows. So I'm going to use a different blue initially. Blue, often a lovely colour to use to interpret shadows. So we can use a bit of that blue. And then this is where we can mix on the page. So I've got a blue, and I'll use, this is sanguine, but it looks like a kind of burnt umber colour. And this I would expect, with a bit of water, to neutralise nicely. You can even see it neutralising here, and give us the feel of shadows. We can just build that in. It's also a nicer warm colour, it's less overwhelming than that deep black. I'll just put in another bit of blue here as well. And we can see actually that even without water, these colours are melding together and forming a reasonably effective shadow. As we move through the process, what I found most effective is to just use less and less water. So each time we add a little layer of colour, we're a bit more selective, using a slightly smaller brush, or other little changes, just to create a more layered and gentle feeling. We can then start moving the colours more specifically. So I can start moving these colours into these trees more specifically. I can lift this deep colour from over here and pop a little bit into these trees again. And as things are drying, and this is the wonderful thing about these kind of things, same with watercolour pencils, is we don't need to wait for things to totally dry to be able to come and do our layering. So I can now come in and do these same shadows without worrying that they're going to totally go everywhere on me. Yes, we had a bit of escape up here, but that was because of all the water I added, not because I added extra pigment on top. And here I can do these same shadowy ideas, little textures even, little textures around, being pretty confident that they're not going to run away. With watercolours, if I was painting these same ideas, might have to wait for it to dry, might have to be more patient. That's yet another reason why I've really enjoyed using these outside, because you don't have the same issues with having to wait around for everything to dry. Now, I'm actually really happy with how this feels. It's got a suggestion of the landscape. Look at these amazing textures. The last bit I want to do is come back with another thing we can do with this, which is much harder to do with watercolour, and that is add some white on top. So here we can add a little bit of our white pastel just to create, again, texture. Even in the sky we could lift or get the idea of clouds just by gently applying this texture to the page. Just softly adds a little bit of light. We can add them more sort of boldly into the tree to suggest light flowing through there, or have little bits of flick coming up like this, interacting with this shadow and showing that it is indeed a shadow. We can do the same because they're opaque. Look, we can do the same with our yellow. Again, this is where we talked about it being different. It's not the same as painting with watercolours. We actually have an opaque medium that we can put on top. Not like true oil paintings. No, not like true oil paintings. But somewhere a lot further along that road than with watercolours. You can really layer up. But we could also make things busy and excessive. So, last little touch, a little bit more of this black, just to come back in on top and really promote the idea of some of these initial shapes. And there you go. With that, I'm going to call my very simple landscape done. And hopefully you can get an idea from this, the kind of possibilities with these pastels. As I said, I've also used them in another video, and I'll pop a link to that down below. And in that video I did a series of 9 different urban sketches out and about, applying a minimal bit of colour and really just splashing things on. But this is where I think they're strongest, producing fun, simple landscapes, whether that's in the comfort of your home or out and about on plein air. I think these really do have a wonderful place in an experimental sketches library of goods. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.